This is Dave Monk at Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And we're running aboard myself and talking that Dave has a cold. So forgive my crudities, but let's look at my poop sheet. This is WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and first thing we have is in passing. We lost Kurt Folick this week. Many of you won't know Kurt. He's an attorney on the third floor of the Lincoln Building, which is right close to us. But Kurt for years was an attorney for the city of Champaign, and then he became a specialist in bonds and organizing those sorts of things that allow cities and larger bodies like park districts, forest preserves, to make application for funding, and they need equivalent funds to go to the federal government or to the state or to private bodies, and that is bonded so that you can pay it back over a series of years, and that's kind of a technical thing. So Kurt would do that with agencies, and he was very expert at it, and so we'll miss him. He had a heart problem and passed away on Friday. So we sympathize with Peg, his wife, and all the staff that's there. It's very hard to pick up after an attorney and to know what you need to do. So back now onto the favorite topic of Route 45, 150, Rantoul, and the areas where we look at and are concerned about. Route 45 is in the process of being upgraded to a powerful grid. The power lines were already pretty powerful. They're on tall wooden poles, exceptionally tall wooden poles, but they're being replaced by towers that are steel and probably best part of 100 feet high. In order to do that, Ameren, who is the electrical body in charge, has to contract with subcontractors to put in the pedestals that will carry these poles, to have electricians and linesmen to transfer the line to a upgrade, and that is a very technical thing. I'm there because, and others too, are there because the whole corridor of 1 mile between Windsor Road and Curtis Road is a prairie. It is relatively native. It has been disturbed a little for road widening and for borrow. That means taking material for roadside development and railroad development, but still it's got nice native patches with interesting range of prairie plants that just didn't come from us planting them. It was there but to start with, and it's all we have left of a corridor that went from Champaign to Pesotum, which is 14 miles away. So we lost a lot of prairie in that widening of the road, which was eventually after Curtis Road is widened out to adjacent to the railroad line. We'll have 6, I think it is, pedestals on our corridor. And I say ours, it's not really ours. It's largely the Department of Transportation adjacent to 45, and partly the Canadian National Railroad. The Department of Transportation recognizes the value of the site. It's put signs up on it to say prairie preservation. It's seeded the corridor adjacent to the road with seedings that are in recognition of the prairie and helpful to its preservation. If I take you on a profile, when planners plan to work on such corridors, they have a profile, and every so many feet there'll be a profile so that you know what you're working with. The profile from Route 45 east is as follows. The first, probably 10 feet down to a ditch, is mainly prairie grasses. Big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, bootaloo, or side oats, and little cord grass here and there that came with the ditch in the first place, and a few broadleaves that have come over from the true prairie. So we're going down the ditch. In the ditch there's usually some wetland species, carracks and wetland species like where there's a drain that comes across from the Savoy Village mall there will be cattails. We're not necessarily supportive of a lot of cattails, but they're short indicators of wetland, and if you were mowing in that area you certainly would avoid the cattails because it's where you would get bogged. But it's pleasing to us to have this range of habitat. So now you go up the other side and the mixture gets a little more diverse, and then on the top between the crest of the ditch and the railroad is halfway decent prairie, and it's been dipsy-doodled into a little here and there, but it's sometimes got an embankment which makes it awkward to handle. It doesn't have an access road through it. It's only about 50 feet wide at one end and perhaps not even 50 feet wide at the Curtis Road end. So you're encouraged to walk through it, not in an alligator style, not all on the same corridor, but to walk through it so that it hardens if you're planting seeds at the time when it's being fixed by road developers. But you can walk in from across the road, right till the traffic is down, and walk across, and you can, in spring you can see a delightful little display of thousands of starry-eyed grass. You can go later in the season, June, July, you have quite a delightful spectrum of prairie plants, and then in the fall you get the grasses coming up, Indian grass, the big blue stem, the little blue stem, and it is a very wonderful expression of prairie that's very close to the people that go by it. And so it's a very public site, and we're very pleased with that. But when you're talking to Ameren, plans are made. We've been talking about these plans for years, where the main lines go, where they go across the bottom of Champaign, where they go up to Bonneville and other places. It means working with administration and getting things right at the top level. You don't usually get a plan because we're on this prairie, we don't own it, we cherish it, and several generations have been involved in preserving it. So it's not just one group of people, it's been a lot of different people who have looked after this prairie, and the Savoy Village Board and others have had to, some of them love it and some of them don't exactly love it because it looks like weeds and it could be a mown corridor. The mown corridors are often used as an example of being neat as you come into town. It could even be herbicided and planted to rinky-dink trees or whatever. So we're very, very lucky to have it and to have people who support it. But then you have to be there with the people who are working it, because the message doesn't always filter down to the people who are on board. So it's important that some representatives of this prairie be around. It's a little bit difficult because the Red Bison group is a student group that's in charge of the prairie, and most of the construction happens in the summer months when students are otherwise engaged. Even if they're in town, they're often busy doing theses and things like that. So I've been standing around and trying to communicate with people, and the workers are very helpful, but they do have construction easements, and as I think I said last week, I was asked to keep off a site because it was a construction easement. It was a put-down easement that I was on, where drills and other equipment is kept while it's being dealt with. So we had to talk to not only the foreman, but to police people who came, and I think it was an education for all. And I think one of the things we do with prairie preservation when it's not well known is we start to talk to people to let them know what's going on. I'm tempted to activate a field trip to this site. Let me suggest that at 3 o'clock I'll take a field trip to Route 45 and then go across towards St. Joe and look at the 150 field or the 150 construction. So let's tentatively think about that, and I'll be here at 3 o'clock. If no one arrives, that's okay. If someone arrives, I'll take them to 45. It'd probably take no more than an hour to see these sites and to see what's happening, because often a lot of us don't know what's going on. And it's absolutely amazing some of the things that are going on. First of all, you have to put down a pedestal. The pedestal's on the backside of a moraine, so it has to be deep, because backsides of moraines don't drain as well as the front side of a moraine, where the glacier dribbled out, like at the Yankee Ridge. So this is the backside of the Peasoda moraine, soft and fairly moist, and if you leave a rock on it for 50 years, the rock will gradually disappear into the soil. So in order to stabilize their towers, you have to put down a decent-sized pedestal. You will only see about 4 feet at the top, but it will be down, the total pedestal will be about 20 feet in all. That's on the straightaway. When you get to a corner, or where you're going to have several power lines coming in, you tend to want to have a deeper pedestal, and those pedestals are up to 60 feet deep, and each pedestal has rebar in it, and the rebar is often 1.5 inches rebar. It's huge, and that gives strength to the concrete. And usually there are bolts left in the top so that you can put the pedestal on the bolts and tighten up the bolts. You don't have to put the tower directly on concrete where you can adjust the concrete. You put bolts down and you tighten those bolts up variously so that you can have a vertical tower. I was down there on Thursday watching linesmen. Now, what you have at the moment is the makings of the new corridor. You have a 100-foot easement. That's 100 foot by 100 foot, where they've agreed to come in from the road rather than from linearly along the prairie. That saves the dignity of the rest of the prairie. So you have a road into the construction site. The road has to go over the roadside ditch. That means you put down a blanket, and you put gravel on that blanket, and you put on top of that blanket, you put a 50 feet long, 1.5 foot diameter corrugated pipe to take the water that might happen during the 2 months that they're working with this job. And then you put gravel over the top of that, and so that gets that invades the prairie some, but it is invading that part which has been planted on the side of the road and planted on the ditch. It doesn't really hurt the the main prairie. Well, then the main prairie, what they've been doing is putting down pallets on the main prairie. They mowed in early spring so that there were no trees, so that you have visual corridor. Then they mow again immediately before they work on the putting in the culverts, and then they put down these pallets, which are like 10 foot by 10 foot and about 2 or 3 inches deep. And we're hoping that they allow the prairie to breathe. The prairie is mostly perennial and has deep roots, and we're hoping it will come back. So it's sort of a cooperative agreement where Ameren gets what it wants to do, the prairie people get what they want to see happen, and the railroad, likewise, doesn't like trees on their line, and so they are removed too. This is very costly. We could not do this ourselves. So this is a cooperative venture between 3 parties. And the administration that's doing this knows about it, and we talked to their landscape vegetation people who are responsible for vegetation along the lines. It has some in principles, because if you are treating this one gently, there may be 100 miles somewhere else that's not being treated so gently. It's become very easy to take herbicide and herbicide the corridor, and in blankets herbicide, not spot herbicide, not just go to a tree and get that tree out. Whereas in the past, you used to use some spot herbiciding, but mostly you would use mechanical means to get rid of the trees. Well, I stood there on Thursday and I watched the linesmen, and they're taking the lines off the old corridor and putting them onto the new one. And it's amazing to see a reach crane, which is or a man crane. It folds up on the back of a truck, but as you get it undone, it can take 2 men in a bucket 100 feet in the air. So they're there with the top of the tower, and they're like 100 feet up, and they need to put the old wires on pulleys so that the old wire will pull the new cable through. The new cable will probably be more heavy duty than the old one, but this is the process they use. And in order to do that, you have to have linesmen that are able to climb up those poles and swing in situations that you think you would never want to do. So they help on the pole, and the men in the bucket grab the line with a nice little couple on the end of a crane, and that line is lifted up to the new corridor, and it's put on pulleys so that it will be able to pull through. And I was kind of amazed. It's only a few days since they were there putting in a pedestal, putting in the tower, and even the drilling equipment is amazing. It's for a big pedestal, but like 10 feet across, you have to have a 10-foot wide drill that brings this dirt up, and you have to have banks of water. So there's trucks down there on Curtis Road, as you can see at the moment, where there's water to help you drill. And you also have to have a caisson that goes down, because when you dig a hole in soft territory, and especially in sandy territory, the hole can fall in. So they drill inside the caisson, and sometimes they leave it there if it's what they think they should do. So that's enough for 45. Remember that this is an impersonal thing. This is going on all over the country because we all need more electricity, and the old lines are overused, pushing more electricity through them than they were designed for. They resist, and then they drop down, and sometimes they catch onto a tree and short. Or if you have a fire and you have a carbon arc from the fire, the carbon arc can lead to a short too. The new towers are high enough that they may avoid problems that we face when we're doing a controlled burn, for instance. So in principle, and look at the lines, there's several types. There's also radio communication towers that are involved with keeping these lines afloat and checking them out. There's also another set of the same lines, same type of line, on the east side of that railroad line. And I'm watching to see whether the Prairie comes back and how long the linesmen will be there and how long it will take to get the Prairie back in action. It was nice to be challenged by the foreman, who also called up St. Louis to get an idea from the legal people who control the easement, and have the police come and we talk. And so the policeman and the foreman, we normally don't get this opportunity to talk to each other, and that was quite helpful, and I was pleased to be a party to that, although I was also the target. It makes it a little bit more difficult for me to be doing this, because you become a target, you become recognized as, or that's the guy that asks questions here, and but somebody should be there. Somebody should be there speaking for the Prairie, of which we have so little, and it's a reminder to workers who are quite sympathetic, actually, when you start to talk to them and have time to talk to them. They understand somewhat you're doing. Some of them are hunters, some of them are farmers, some of them know the difference between a Drummond and a Flanagan soil and a skeletal soil like Xenia. And you have that rapport, and it's that rapport that makes it helpful for us to work. Transfer all this to Route 150 from Urbana, about where Walmart is, all the way to St. Joe. It's about 6 miles. 1 mile into St. Joe is over flatland where the soil conservation people and others have been working to put in a bottomland forest on a big meander where the river Salt Fork was channelized, and this big meander was left. It's a sort of cut off meander, and it's flatland. It's not too good for agriculture because it really it gets wet and you can't grow crops there, but you can grow trees. There's enough drainage that the trees aren't bugged out by the fact that they might have too much water. So you sort out your trees and you sort out your plants, and that has been restored. That area is not being violated by any roadside development. Go back to Urbana, and again we're looking at a linear corridor. It's in flatland. You have nearby, you have a Yankee Ridge Moraine, which is part of the glaciated system, and there's more gravel on it. And so water drains from the end of that into the Salt Fork. You have a cemetery at Mayview, which is likewise glaciated and probably heavy on gravel, and that falls out of the melting glacier 10,000 years ago. And in between, you have these flatland areas, which are tremendously difficult to work with. It's the sort of place that was last developed in Champaign County because no one knew how to get rid of the water. And until people from places like Friesland and Deutschland and European situations that have the same sort of poor drainage. And they knew how to drain, and so they would create little rivers, various ways of doing it. One was to take a big plow and plow a ditch. Another one was to put make a big hole and put a pontoon in it and put a crane on the pontoon, and then you had a drag line and you could make a river as you went down the river. So some of these rivers are designed by the natural landscape, but also by humans that are digging the corridor. So you've got flatland, and the question is, if I run you from Urbana to St. Joe, you're going to have to look at the profile along the road. And if you leave Route 130, which is near Walmart, you go up a little hill, and then you go down a slope, and then you get to Cottonwood, and it's very low, and then you go up to Bayview Cemetery, and then along towards Fulls, and then to Pioneer Grain. And at each level, there's a drain that comes through from that slight slope from Yankee Ridge, and it runs through, sometimes it runs through culverts under the road and goes north to the Salt Fork. Sometimes there's an organized drainage ditch. Sometimes there's no drainage ditch. The water just oozes out onto the farmland and acts as wetland. And it seems like the corn can handle that. It's not too wet. If you have a 5-inch rainfall, that's what's going to happen. So you have slight rises and falls. At Cottonwood, there's a lot of accumulation of moisture, because if you go back to that little community that's near to Aldi's, and the water runs west, but it runs under the road, under the Kickapoo Railroad line, which is parallel to 150, and it goes into detention ponds, which are behind Walnut, which you don't see very much, but they eventually drain out. So some of the water is coming down, going west, going across, going east, and there's several drains there that feed into the south side of the road, and it goes down to Cottonwood. Well, this always accumulates water, and there's a bird bath that is not very popular. When you have a 5-inch rain, you have water there. So the road improvement, it basically has bitumened or asphalted the whole 5 miles, except for where Cottonwood is, and that is going to be raised up by 3 feet. And the 3 feet, we are hoping, will be soil and gravel and riprap from sources that are gravelly, not the prairie soils that they were worried about. So the longitudinal, what would you call it, a schematic, is up a little hill, down a fairly low spot, up a little, and it rolls. So very gently you see the bulldozers have made the corridor a little larger, to take a little more water, but there are saddles every so often where the water will run one way and then run the other way. Now, go to those spots and look at the soil cross profile. And you'll let me go from the south side of the road. Let me go to Cottonwood, which is where the problem is, or a problem. There are 3 corridors. One is an old interurban, which ran from about 1905 to about 1950s, and came in with electricity because it was an electrical line, about 37 feet wide. Then there is the Conrail line, various. It was Penn Central at some stages. I think it was New York Central at one stage. Been in ownership of various different railroad lines. The last owner was Conrail, and then it went to abandonment. We were aware of that abandonment, so we applied for an interim trail use agreement, and we achieved that, and that's what allowed us to eventually, a whole bunch of people involved, a bunch of organizations ranging from the federal government to the state government to the local government to park districts, forest reserves, and individuals. So there's a whole lot of people involved. That's very good. It lets people know what's going on, and there are various questions. So that corridor is there. Then next to that, because roads always follow, or mostly, it was easy for the road to follow the railroad. The railroad came first. So that railroad, we didn't get enough money to buy it quickly. And the railroads were interested. The railroads were, it was anticipated that they would buy immediately they got the chance. And they did. So CSX owned the railbed for quite some time, and in that period it gave an easement to the road. So the road widening involves the trail next door, and it involves various amounts of that trail, where there is a culvert or water running through from under the railroad line, now abandoned. Then there is sometimes block drainage, because sometimes those culverts rot out in the middle and you don't even notice it. You've got a drain that's not functional. So there are a number of these drains, and I think they're all functional, but where you see an accumulation of water when you wouldn't expect to, it might just be because there's a culvert out of action. So eventually, all those agencies involved have worked the devil off and got to buy the line from Conrail, from CSX. So now the trail people own their line, but there is an easement, which is a public easement, an in perpetuity easement, and we're a little disappointed that we lose the prairie there. Part of the reason for buying this line or taking out an interim trail use agreement was to preserve the prairie. You have 100 feet, you have a ballast down the middle, and on either side, ballast is probably 15 feet, depending on how high you have to have the embankment, and there's prairie alongside. So if you have been around on 150 for 100 years, you will have noticed that the prairie is strong on that corridor, and that the easement along the corridor adjacent to the roadside contains a lot of prairie. Even the old easement of the road itself, the Department of Transportation easement, contains prairie. So you have to know that there are not only the prairie plants, but there's the bacteria and the microorganisms and the things that are in there. The disappointment is that the widening will be on that borrowed or that permanent easement. So it will take a large chunk of the little prairie that we had. The technique is, let's look at that profile again. You're going from the interurban, sort of a little bit lower than the railroad line, and you have a drainage ditch, and you go up over the railroad line, now abandoned, and then you go down, and you have this 150, the road from abandoned to St. Joe, and then you have another ditch, and you have farmland. Well, the change will mean that fiber optics and water lines to St. Joe are being put on the north side, because once they're dug in and covered over, farmers can still farm their land. There are still some cables on the south side in that easement that we've been talking about, dug down probably 6 or 8 feet, so you could still grow things on them. So the question is now, how do you revamp this ditch? The ditch is going to be a little further to the south, because the road is not being widened by much. It's about 2 feet on either side. And the ditch, though, is having to be moved south a little bit into that easement that we have. And it does involve taking some of the prairie topsoil, that rich soil. I've been looking at it. It's some of the richest soil in the world. Really nice, deep Drummer and Flanagan soils. Very jealous of it. Some of it is too much, and it has to be so the Forest Preserve has been, which manages the Kickapoo line, has been getting up to 50 truckloads of soil. Now, often that soil that has to be cut is on slightly higher ground, so it may not necessarily be Drummer or Flanagan. It's more like a zinnia or skeletal soil. So it might be a little bit more gravelly, a little bit more clay than the deep, rich Drummer or Flanagan. but still, you got a beautiful contribution of soil, which is already spread out at the Forest Preserve at Homer Lake. You can go visit. Homer Lake has a lot of restoration prairies, and so this is in a good location. Come back to the prairie again. How do you remodel the prairie? Well, if you're on a drainage ditch, one of the traditional things to do is to take a hi-ho and sit on either side of the ditch, and you have a laser beam which helps you to keep your water flowing at just the right level. And you waddle your hi-ho along, and you ditch out, and you put the ditch material away if it has to be carted away for a later fill to raise the road by 3 feet, and you can do that. But what you do is, if you only have 2 inches to remove from the top of the soil, you do that, and it leaves the roots underneath there ready to grow, and that comes back. The easier way to do it, and the more efficient way from an engineer's point of view, is to take a road plow and road plow that whole corridor into the ditch and up the side of the road and into the easement on the Kickapoo Trail. You plow it, and then you bring in a bulldozer, which is operating with GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, so that you can do something like a laser beam, and they then remodel the corridor, which means you disturb a lot of soil. You chop up the plants, which might be 20 or 100 or 150 years old, and you have a neat corridor. You put erosion control material at various locations, just so that the water won't take the newly disturbed soil and erode it, and that's a new ditch. In cooperation, the Department of Transportation has allowed the Forest Preserve to take soil, but it's also allowed the Forest Preserve, the Grand Prairie Friends, the Prairie State Committee on Natural Areas through the university, and others like Heartland Pathways, to take plants from that area that's going to be disturbed and chopped up. And I'm not sure where all those plants are gone, but I know we have already been taking a little bit of soil for inoculum, because we have prairie sites that haven't had that rich soil and all the microbes, and so it can benefit a lot from the input of the creatures that are in the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, the small animals and the like. You have to do it when the soil is fairly recently disturbed, because if you sit those things out in the sunlight for too long, you're not going to have the wonderful agglomeration of creatures that are there. Excuse me. So we're still wondering where all this water is going, and if a 5-inch rainfall just means that we'll have a road like Causeway that's 3 feet higher, and the ditches will become a detention pond until all that water oozes out across the fields. But that's a question for hydrologists, and we haven't solved that problem yet, but we're watching to see what the next rain is. And once again, I think I would like to say that if anyone would like to come at 3 o'clock, I'll take you to that site so that you can see what's there, what exists and what will be. One of the concerns is, how do you replant that? Well, I have had communications with the people who are providing the seed, and the roadside itself, the disappointing place here is that some of the prairie soil, the rich prairie soil, will be mounded up right on the edge of the road, so it will never have the capacity to be a prairie again. And there'd be ryegrass and a little bit of switchgrass and redtop and cover crops like wheat or oats, mainly an edge that can be mown. Well, we would like to suggest, there's some suggestions here, that instead of doing a traditional roadside mix that grows fairly quickly, we'd like to put in a fair bit of little blue stem, which can stand some mowing, and use that prairie soil. The little blue stem will go down into that prairie soil and create a mile of rootlets. If you go to a prairie conference and they put a big container, a PVC pipe right down by a little blue plant, then it grows for 5 years. You can get a hi-ho to lift the container up, and you can wash the roots, and the roots go down 18 feet, and you can roll this creature up and put it under your arm and take it to a teaching situation. So the little blue stem can be there, but we would like to have some constraints. One would be, please mow it with a small mower so that you don't have to feel like you have a 15-foot mower that you're afraid to sit on the road, so you have to not only mow the downside, you have to mow the whole area. And it's too large. We'd like a smaller mower, and it will use less energy, and it would be nice. Even better would be have a no-mow facility, or a mow at later in the year. Instead of starting to mow the roadside at August 1, wait till December, wait till late November, where the late blooming prairie plants like New England aster can express themselves, and not only express themselves, but seed, so that you can collect seed. And I would like to think of this corridor as an experimental roadside park adjacent to a trail that it will be wonderful, and will still have some prairie. So I've been wandering along, and the prairie actually is starting to grow. And actually the roadside plow can do some things to not totally plow things. So they can put those disc plow banks a little straighter so the disc plow doesn't go so deep. If you put those banks at a 45-degree angle to the soil, then they go deep and you plow deep. So there is some things that you can do with the road plow. We're hoping perhaps that we can put seed in. So the Department of Transportation has been pretty willing to work with us and allow us to put seed into the mix that they have. There's their mix on the ups. You go down from the road down to a ditch. There's a gusset in a ditch about a foot wide, and then you go up the other side. The other side that's further away from the road is going to take a number 4 and number 5 mix, which are fairly much prairie. So it's just very simplistic prairie. You have to know that a good prairie will have perhaps 50 or 60 species in it, and this might be 4, 5, 6. It might be more than that. It might be 10 or 12. But it's simplistic. We can add to that and help. But if we do that, we'd like that to be a permanent non-mow, and we would not like it to be taken over because somebody feels that they have to mow and not have their 15-foot mower on the road. In other words, they don't like to mow 2 feet with a 15-foot mower, and we don't like that to see that happen too. So some places like Iowa, they do a midnight requisition and bring in some tractors that have a small mower. And it might be able to mow high so that the little blue stem or whatever it is, Bootaloo or low-profile prairie plants can work. And so I've been wandering along there, and I think I start to see the prairie start to grow again. And I think we have the potential to do interesting things. So I'm hopeful, and I would like to take anyone that would be listening. I'll put it down, 3 o'clock. Anyone wants to come, I'll take you on a short field trip. And I think that's informative. Then you can take others and see what we can do to reconstitute this prairie. The prairie has the capacity to reconstitute. It started out on a glacial till, and so it learned how to do that. We need to have a corridor that doesn't have a lot of switchgrass in it, so that it creates a litter that it makes it dangerous if somebody throws out a lighted cigarette, or if we indeed could do controlled burns. It's so awkward to work with. I'd like the mix to be low on switchgrass, but high on some other things, and that means we have to have people to go out and pick seed. So yesterday we were picking Golden Alexander. It was it's a member of the carrot family, umbelliferae. So if you look at the little top of it, it looks like an umbrella. The stays for an umbrella, and it's just ideally ripe at the moment. If it goes a little further, it shatters and you don't get it. So it also is a spring herb, and it's a perennial. But each spring, it's the first item on the prairie to show there's a prairie. And prairie is a little bit dumb in the spring because you don't see the tiny liliaceous things, the small starry-eyed grass. The creatures that are growing in the spring are not very dominant, and in fact, when Europeans first came, they couldn't get their cattle fed with what's on the prairie because it doesn't come till June, July, and August and September. So that's why they brought in a whole bunch of European plants to augment this, so that they could have calving early in March, and they would have food, and they would also have the hay that would come with this sort of situation. You could have hay fields, you could have sweet clover, and you could mow it 8 times a year. You could store that up and also have cows lactating early in the spring. So back to the little prairie, we're hoping that we plant. Now the question might be, prairie seed can handle hard soil. Weeds love soft soil. So the next thing is, do we get the Department of Transportation to plant their seed and then firm it down with a roller? Or do we wait till we have enough seed to be able to... I can't imagine having enough seed to be able to put it in a hydro seeder, or get the seed into a grassland drill. By the time they're almost ready to plant it now. So I think they have to plant their own seed. The good question is, where does it come from? Does that seed come from Kansas or other places? So we're hoping to have seed from local territory. We've been told we will have, but it's very unlikely, because the thing is that it's easier to get seed from out of state, because you can, once you're over the Mississippi, you're likely to be able to do seed harvest with a combine, whereas if you're going to pick seed in Illinois, you're going to work with people hand picking. So we need hand picking people. So 3 o'clock on Friday, we'll be going out to pick various seeds that are getting ripe. It's early in the season yet, but we won't have our seed together, or the Forest Preserve won't have its seed together. Well, the Grand Prairie Friends won't have its seed together, I very much doubt, by the time the Department of Transportation wants to plant. So perhaps we don't roll it just yet, but wait till we've added seed and then get to roll it. But can you get contractors to come back? Probably not, so you might want to roll it before the contractors go. There's lots of questions out there. We'd like to share them with you. And yeah. Please come and enjoy the prairie. I had a few other things to say. We've had a corn festival yesterday, a sweet corn festival. I thought it was very nice. I was meeting people there The weather was good. The antique cars were there. A few trucks too, and I enjoyed poking around that for a while. I do have some thoughts for overall planning that I think might go along with what we do with prairies. There's an article that I pulled out of the newspaper, which is where the lawmakers are aware that there are corridors that we've saved across the country, or that others have saved across the country, and lawmakers support east-west rail corridor. So this is a little bit disappointing for trail developers, but this is the whole point of the Rail Banking Act and trails. The trails are there until we get to have other things. So they're talking about a rail trail that comes from the Quad Cities to Bloomington, and an east-west corridor that goes through to Danville, and I would extend that to Indianapolis. And there are people who get rather disappointed when I remind them that the rail trail is there as an interim establishment, and if you want to put a rail back, you might want to modify it for modern equipment, but it can at least be east-west to Danville, and possibly to Indianapolis, and possibly further on. And rails are a cheap way of moving industrial materials. So there's always a debate between the people movers that are heavily subsidized and don't make money, and the freight lines that are getting up to 200 cars. And I was standing there picking seed just a day or two ago, and there was 3 engines on the front of this train, and in the middle of the train there was another engine. And I forget the initials that it goes by, but it's sort of designed to push the cars together so they aren't all pulling on, straining their connections. So this usually indicates a 200 car train. It can't stop easily because it stops traffic. You have to know that this is more than a mile long, and probably can stop traffic on 2 section roads. And excuse me. And you have to think about this. I have to think about if they open up that sort of corridor, why couldn't you have a interurban train between Mahomet and Parkland College and Champaign and Urbana and Falls and St. Joe, or even Danville? So you would have a Parkland station, and I would put that high school, which I don't like to see up there and on North End, down behind Parkland College. So you'd have gaming fields for Judah Christian and a new high school and a college, and I would say there's another line that comes in from Monticello. How could we work and plan and think about saving that Marine's life through to Mahomet? And Mahomet and St. Joe are burgeoning with rapidly growing number of people. So think about looking at your landscape in broader dimension. Go to Rantoul and think about how you could create a national park from Paxton, where there's nice prairie, and you go up the Bloomington Moraine and down, and so you give people a chance to work with that sort of situation and experience farming, and the farming would be kept intact, and you'd find the outwash plain and perhaps channel people to Flatwell and the like. So dream about your landscape in more than just the individual prairie, and I think it's time we were off the air, and this has been Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.